Why do a video on the Pope's coffin, you might ask? It seems on face value to be a bit of a creepy and esoteric topic, but there are many reasons why it is a rather interesting subject to explore. Death is a part of the human condition, there is no escaping it, and funerary practices have a lot to teach us about social attitudes to death in the past, and attitudes to death and dying tell us in turn much about the development of culture and tradition. The funeral rites of a pope, even a reformist pope like Pope Francis, are very conservative and they preserve much of past tradition. What's more, they are very public, and so the form of the papal coffin is made visible. We therefore have before us a fascinating source of information on the development of tradition. That in turn gives a rather unique insight not only into papal funerals, but into funerary practices that were once widespread across European culture and have now mostly fallen into disuse. Now in 2024, Pope Francis reformed the instructions and texts for papal funerals in a reissue of a liturgical text that was first published in the year 2000. It is called the Ordo Exequarum Romani Pontificis, the rite of burial for Roman pontiffs. One of the aspects of the funeral Pope Francis simplified was the form of the coffin that popes have traditionally been buried in, but I'll get on to what changes he made a bit later. They're not really that revolutionary. Up to and including the funeral of Pope Benedict XVI in 2022, popes have long been buried in a three-part coffin, which is a bit like a set of Russian dolls, with the three elements fitting snugly together. The three elements of the coffin each have a particular technical name in English. There is an inner box of timber lined with fabric. This is the coffin proper. This was in turn set within a metal coffin or surround that is properly termed a shell, usually made of lead. This is in turn set within a larger outer box of timber, which is called a case. The various elements have English technical terms because tripartite coffins like this, which are often called lead-lined coffins, were used in England from the 17th century onwards. In fact, they were used throughout the whole of Western Europe. This method for enclosing a corpse for burial was an evolution in the early modern period of the late medieval tradition, one I have spoken about in other videos on medieval royal funerals, of wrapping a dead body in cerecloth, waxed cloth, soldering it into an anthropoidal lead shell, and then placing that in a timber case. At some point, someone realised you could achieve the same ends with less hassle by simply providing a three-part coffin. Such three-part coffins were provided when a body was either to be subjected to very lengthy funeral rituals or was to be interred within a church building, rather than directly in the ground of a churchyard or cemetery. Inhumation in church buildings was quite commonplace up until the 19th century, and from the late 16th century onwards almost always took place within the context of a subterranean burial vault made of stone or brick under a church floor, or in a standing monument within the body of a church. The three-part coffin was developed as an entirely practical expedient for two reasons. Firstly, to ensure the coffin maintained structural integrity for a long period of time, and secondly, to keep air from reaching the corpse and quickly decomposing it, and therefore preventing noisome odours entering the church both during the funeral obsequies or even after the interment. Such coffins were not designed to permanently preserve the body from the natural process of putrefaction. Slower processes of anaerobic decay still took place within the hermetically sealed environment of the coffin. Interestingly, we have lots of evidence from papal exhumations in the 19th and 20th century following the beatification process of popes of what these processes did to a corpse. Pius X, Pius XII and John XXIII were all exhumed in the 20th century. Their bodies were found to still be reasonably intact and had more or less been mummified by the conditions within the three-part coffin. Such coffins, with their use of very costly materials including a good deal of lead, were expensive, and they were initially the preserve of the social elite, of bishops and the upper clergy, royalty, nobility and gentry, although as time went on, the middle classes increasingly used them too. It is not just for papal funerals that such coffins are used today. It is simply that we don't get to see the structure of them in the same way that we do at a Pope's burial. For example, Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth II and her husband, the Duke of Edinburgh, were similarly buried in 3-part coffins within the vault below King George VI's chapel in Windsor Castle. The British were a bit squeamish about these things, and at their funerals we didn't even get a glimpse of the wood of the outer case of the coffin, as they were hidden under funeral palls. So let's have a look in detail at the structure of the papal coffin, using as our primary guide the evidence we have from the funeral of Pope Benedict XVI, who died a little over 2 years ago. At the end of his lying in state in St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican, Pope Benedict's body was placed inside a coffin that was made of cypress wood. There is no symbolism to the timber used for this, it is purely practical. Cypress wood is lightweight, it is stable and it is durable, and doesn't warp or readily split. It is a soft wood and is also easy to work and takes a nice stain and polish. As a resinous wood, it is to a large degree water resistant and resistant to rot, and it also has a pleasant odour to it, which is all useful in a funerary context. Pope Benedict's cypress coffin was made of narrow planks of timber glued together and carefully jointed with dovetail joints, and it was lined, as per tradition, with red velvet. One thing that is rather distinctive about papal coffins is the unusual depth of them. They are particularly deep. The lid of the cypress wood coffins for both Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict XVI were carved with their coat of arms. After his funeral mass, the cypress coffin of Pope Benedict was taken down to the grotto under St. Peter's and to his burial site. The first thing that was undertaken then was the sealing of the coffin. It was bound with red ribbon, one running lengthways and one widthways, which were then sealed with sealing wax, into which was impressed the seal of office of the Camerlengo of the Holy Roman Church, the cardinal who was responsible for the funeral arrangements. Presumably the purpose of this sealing is to ensure that the remains have not been tampered with if at a later date the coffin is then exhumed, if, say, the particular pope is declared a saint. This sealed cypress coffin is then placed into the outer elm case, which is already lined on the inside with the lead shell. The lid of the lead shell is then put on top of the cypress coffin, and the overlap from the sides of the shell are turned down and soldered to the lid by the Vatican plumbers, with further seals being inset into the molten solder as they progress. On the lid of the lead shell are attached 3 bronze coffin plates. The first is a cross, then below it is a coffin plate bearing the name, style, title and dates of the occupant, while below that is the occupant's papal arms. Then the lid of the outer elm case is put in place and it is fixed down. Now on this lid, the bronze coffin plates are then repeated. Now, interestingly, some earlier papal coffins had a rather fetching skull and crossbones as a piece of coffin furniture on the lid. This photo shows the coffins prepared for Pope Pius XII in 1958, and you can see the skull and crossbones on the outer case. Repeating the coffin plates on the outer lid of the case as well as on the lead shell is a traditional feature of such coffins right across Europe, and there's a really good reason for it. After many hundreds of years, it is usual for the outer wooden case of coffins of this sort to begin to decay, to gradually fall to pieces, and for the outer coffin plates to fall away as the timber then disintegrates. It is striking how quickly such decay begins to become apparent. This is the coffin of Pope John Paul II, exhumed at his beatification 6 years after his death. The surface polish has already begun to disappear on the outer case, and the tight joints are already beginning to warp. This is what coffins of this form tend to look like after 150 years or so of being kept in a burial vault or a catacomb. The outer cases have very often decayed entirely to reveal the lead shell below. This also demonstrates the vital importance of the shell. Were these coffins not to have an internal lead shell, the bones of these individuals would now be scattered across the vault floor. The lead shells take much longer to decay, and so a set of coffin plates attached to that ensures that the remains can still be identified after a considerable period of time. So what has Pope Francis changed with respect to papal coffins? Well, not an awful lot really. He has done away with the canaletto, as it is termed, the platform on which the Pope's body was traditionally displayed on cushions, and his body has been put directly into a prepared coffin from which he will now not be removed. And this has necessitated some structural changes to the coffin's form. The coffin is quite evidently not just a simple and humble timber box. It is still a multi-part coffin. Pope Francis is to be buried in a burial vault below the floor of the Church of Santa Maria Maggiore, and so some precautions need to be made to ensure that the coffin is a sealed receptacle. We know from the new edition of Ordo Exequiarum that the coffin is to be of timber lined with zinc rather than lead. The coffin is the same trapezoidal shape of the previous papal coffins, has the same jointing, but it isn't as deep, which is presumably to allow the coffin to function during the lying in state and to display the Pope's remains when people come to pay their respects in St. Peter's Basilica. The coffin wood used is noticeably bulkier than either the internal cypress coffin or the outer case that Pope Benedict was buried in. It is evidently made of a thicker grade of timber than either of these, and it appears to be made of the traditional elm. The zinc lining is a very sensible alternative to the traditional lead, given that the whole coffin has to be carried at various points in procession. Zinc is almost half as light by mass than lead, and it has the added advantage that it decays at a slower rate. The zinc shell is presumably below the internal red velvet lining that you can see. The strip of red velvet material forming a sort of valance over the edges of the coffin is a new innovation too, and is presumably designed to hide the appearance of the edges of the zinc shell. On the night before the funeral, when the coffin will be closed, this will presumably be removed. The zinc shell will receive its lid and will be soldered shut in the traditional manner before the timber lid is fixed. Presumably the coffin will still have the traditional two sets of coffin plates, one attached to the inner zinc shell and the other to the outer timber case. Given that a separate cypress coffin will not be used, it won't be possible, of course, to perform the traditional sealing of the coffin with red ribbon and wax seals. All told, Pope Francis's coffin is not really a great revolution. Yes, there is innovation in form and in practice, but it still reflects continuity and tradition, both with papal and Western European funerary practice in general. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy this channel, you're bound to enjoy my magazine, The Antiquary. Published every month, it is a labour of love for me, and in it I explore some of the more obscure aspects of our shared history, all beautifully illustrated in full colour. It ships across the world, is offered in print and digital format, and readers give it 5 stars on Google. If you love your history like me, particularly the history of objects, buildings, people and places, why not consider subscribing? Subscribing helps support my work and the channel too. There's a link above and in the video description that takes you to the magazine website.